today in these videos about institutions and growth. So your homework for Monday, maybe by the time you've watched these videos, is to go take a look at the Fraser Index, the Fraser Institute's measures of institutions. So I want to back out a little bit and talk big picture about these. So as we talked about in the last series of lectures and this morning in classes, rules matter. The rules or institutions determines people's incentives to invest in physical capital, human capital, and ideas, as well as organizational structures. They also determine their incentives to apply these ideas and use them effectively. The rules determine whether investment takes place at all, and if it takes place, whether it takes place domestically or abroad. Right? But as I mentioned before, what rules matter? Can we do better than this? And again, reiterating this, another way, right? Again, the way to look at this is, are the returns greater than the value of consumption? If not, nobody's going to invest. If the returns abroad are greater than the returns domestically, people will invest abroad. And so while there will be investment, that investment will be abroad, and it will not increase the stock of the factors of production locally. So we can end up trapped down in the bottom, which is where we spent most of human history and where some places around the world still are today. We can also end up top in this virtuous cycle called growth, which we have up until recently. I suspect the economy will slow significantly. We may even see an economic contraction rather than expansion as a result of the current virus load. My hope is that that is a short-term phenomenon and we will return to growth before too long. Now, another way of looking at this is, do people have incentives to produce ideas? If people don't have an incentive to produce new ideas, we're going to have no ideas. Let's now, and this, by the way, will be a preview of what we're going to talk about when we talk about growth models, but we still have to go back and talk about GDP as well. So this is a little bit of a preview. Turns out ideas also matter. But so if we have no incentive to produce ideas, there will be no new ideas. And in effect, we're going to be stuck again. We won't have any growth. We won't have any new products. We won't have any new organizational structures. Then the question is, let's say that there are incentives to produce ideas. Then the question is going to be, are there incentives to apply those ideas? If there are no incentives to apply the ideas, again, we will have no new ideas and we'll be stuck down here. On the other hand, if we have incentives to produce ideas and we have incentives to apply ideas, then we're going to end up with what we're going to talk about later with increasing returns. We're going to have growth again. So, let's talk big picture about institutions and rules. So this is taken from an survey article by Oliver Williamson. If any of you are interested in reading it, it's an accessible article. Basically, there was a discussion and an argument within economics, and there still remains that discussion and argument, which is, which level of institutions matter, right? The ones we've listed out sound nice, but maybe there are other ones. And he basically says, look, you can sort of say there are roughly 4 levels of institutions. At the deepest level, we have customs, traditions, norms, and religion. It's what I will probably end up referring to as culture up here. We also then have the formal rules of the game. We could probably talk about this as the constitutional levels. So what can government officials do? What are they empowered to do? And then down here, we have the laws that they pass. In other words, what we call the legislative level. And then down here, we have the level of resource allocation and employment that's usually carried out by companies, firms, entrepreneurs, and individuals. So the idea here would be that customs, traditions, norms, and religion take a really long time to change compared to constitutions. Constitutions, to change them, Williamson says between 10 to 100 years. Again, this is not meant to be an empirically true statement. It's meant to give us some sense of the scale. Legislation can be changed relatively quickly compared to a constitution, and then firms are constantly changing how they allocate their resources. Now, why this is important is we can think about this as the customs, traditions, norms, and religion determine what is feasible at the constitutional level. In other words, do we play basketball or do we play soccer, right? Customs, traditions, norms, and religion are going to determine then the rules governing these. So this would be the formal rules of basketball. Then we have the play of the game. This would be how the referees call the game. And then this down here, resource allocation, would be akin to how where teams put players. Another way of looking at this would be the Iraqi constitution says that the source of all law and truth is the Quran. So that's in the constitution. Would that be feasible given our customs, norms, and religion in this country? Maybe, maybe not, right? Some people would like to put some statement into the Constitution about a specific deity. So far, we haven't done that, and that seems to not be feasible given our customs, traditions, norms, and religion. Now, over time, this will feed back up, or can feed back up. It doesn't always. But a nice example of this is the 3-second rule in basketball. Now, I'm not a big sports fan. I'm missing the sports gene by most accounts. But I do know a little bit about basketball, partially because of this. So, some of you may know the origin of the 3-second rule. Some of you may not even know what it is. But basically, if you watch a basketball game, there is the opponent's key. There's that oval rectangle or the circle at the top and where people shoot free throws from, and then there's the actual key there. It includes the whole thing if memory serves. So in basketball, there's the 3-second rule. In other words, you can't just stand in your opponent's key. Every 3 seconds, you're going to be in their key for at most 3 seconds at a time, at which point you have to leave the key. So let's take the situation where we had decided our customs, traditions, norms, and religion determine that we play basketball. We have the formal basketball rule book, and we then have referees calling the game and teams allocating the resources. Now, some people may think that the 3-second rule has been around since time immemorial, but it's actually not that old. My understanding is that it only came in as a response to Wilt the Stilt. Some of you may have heard of Wilt Chamberlain. And basically, Wilt Chamberlain they called him Wilt the Stilt, and he was a really tall basketball player. And what he would do was his team allocated him to stand down in his opponent's key, stand right under the basket. And as soon as his team got the ball at the other end, they would just chuck it down the court to him. He would catch it and throw it in the basket. Totally legal. However, people eventually said, well, it didn't make for very interesting basketball. So the allocation, the team's resource allocation, allocating Wilt Chamberlain to stand under the basket, eventually fed back up to the formal rules of the game. In other words, it's now written into the NBA and probably the NCAA handbook that you can't be in your opponent's key for more than 3 seconds. Now, of course, had they not done that, probably what would have happened was eventually people would have become disinterested in basketball, and it would have ceased to be part of our customs, traditions, norms, and religion to actually watch basketball. Now, why would we focus on one specific level? Well, it turns out that we know relatively little about customs, traditions, norms, and religion. Although we could talk to anthropologists, and some economists do know a fair bit about it. But to another level, it takes a long time to change customs, norms, and religion. And then down here, resource allocation and employment, that we do focus on as economists. However, that is typically the domain of what we call economics of organizations or industrial organization. It's a class I have taught, and I'm actually teaching this semester as an independent study, looking at those pieces as to how firms allocate their resources. But basically, from a macroeconomic point of view, firm allocation decisions are not going to be driving large-scale economic cycles, at least not an individual firm's decision-making function. So now we're stuck with the formal rules of the constitutional level and the legislative. Now, if you look at the Fraser Index, it actually incorporates a little bit of both, but we typically are going to focus on the formal rules because that determines what's feasible for the referees to do or what's feasible for legislators to do. Of course, that's not entirely true. As I mentioned, if you look at the Fraser Index, it's actually a decent mix of both. And this here is the chart from Williamson's original paper.